Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar, which is Demystifying ESG, what it is and why it's good for business. You're all very welcome. We've got about an hour and a quarter on this webinar. All the usual protocols apply. So if you want to ask questions, can you use the Q&A function? And if you like somebody else's question, just click on that question to like it, and that will help us see how popular a question it is. So just as way of introduction, you all know that the EOA has been running virtual events like this for a year now, and they've been mainly focused on the specifics of either creating or growing employee-owned businesses. However, this new programme of webinars, this Better Business programme, is addressing topics which are not specific to employee ownership, but which we know are topics that really matter to employee-owned businesses as well as every other business. But we'll also be exploring in these sessions whether or not employee-owned businesses are any better placed to handle the challenges or the opportunities that arise from these particular topics. And the way we're going to do that is by inviting some experts, and absolutely delighted we've got 3 with us this morning. So what will happen is not only will you be learning about these topics, but we will be too, because these are topics that will probably not have been at the forefront of me and the team's views and thoughts over the last year. So this week's topic is about ESG, and before we move into that, I just want to put a poll up on the screen to ask each and every one of you just to answer one quick question about this topic of ESG. So you can see quite clearly there, does your organisation have an existing strategy that relates to ESG? Yes, it does. No, it doesn't, but we plan to implement one. No, we don't, and we haven't got a plan either, and you're not sure. So it'd be really helpful if you would all just take a second to complete that poll. It will just give me and the panelists, our experts, a view of the audience and what sort of level we are talking to this morning. And just whilst you're filling that in, if you look at ESG and if you Google it, as many of you probably have done over the last year to really understand a bit more about it, it's quite clear that the E of ESG is about preservation of the natural world, you know, whether that's about carbon emission reduction, whether it's about climate change, whether it's about deforestation. The S is about that consideration of humanity. It's about gender and diversity inclusion, mental health, community and social impact. And of course, the G, the governance, is about running a better business. It's about board representation, it's about remuneration of executives, and it's about employee practices. So that's the topic we're talking about this morning. Let's just look now at the poll results. It'd be helpful just to pop those up on the screen. Interestingly, I can't see those poll results, so I'll need one of the team probably to pop that in the Q&A for me or in the chat. Oh yeah, I can see it now. Here we go. So yes, you do have a strategy. 32% of you, 48% no, you haven't, but you are planning to implement one. Okay, that's good. So that's about 80% of you then have either got one or you're planning to implement one. 13, no, you haven't, and you haven't got any plans. And 6% you're not quite sure. So that's brilliant. Thank you for answering that. Hopefully that reassures you you're in the same sort of space with people who are exploring possibly. I think, you know, 61% of you are in the no bracket at the moment. So with that in mind, I'm going to invite our first guests to speak to us this morning. And I'm absolutely delighted. We've got Andrew Ninian, who is the Director of Stewardship and Corporate Governance at the Investment Association. So Andrew has had 20 years involved in social impact, and the last 7 years, I understand, with the Investment Association, Andrew. And then after Andrew, I'm going to be welcoming Barry Murphy. Barry is a partner at PwC. He's had 20 years plus advising on social equality and social mobility, including, I understand, Barry, being a mentor at the School of for Social Entrepreneurs. So we've got 2 brilliant experts to start this conversation this morning. So first of all, Andrew, I'd like to welcome you to your first EOA event, I think. First time.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. I guess to start with, let's really go back to basics. Well, first of all, you can tell us a little bit about the Investment Association and your sort of insights into this ESG space. But I'd really like to start with, what is ESG? Where did it come from?
Okay, so let me start with the Investment Association. So we are the trade body for asset managers. So if you have a pension fund or you have a pension, then it's likely that an asset manager invests that pension on your behalf to deliver a return on your savings so that you have something to retire on. And so we are the trade body for asset managers. We have about 250 members who manage about 8.5 trillion worth of assets for savers, both in the UK, but around the world. And particularly for my role at the Investment Association, the important stat is our members own on behalf of their clients about a third of the UK PLC, so listed companies. And one of the roles that we have is to set out that aggregate view of our members, so the aggregate view of that 1/3 of UK PLC, actually how should the companies be run and what are the expectations of the shareholders in those companies so that they deliver long-term returns as shareholders and ultimately as pension savers. So we are, our role is to try and promote good governance, good long-term value creation within the companies in which our members invest, so that actually all companies improve and deliver better long-term returns for end savers. And where does ESG come from then?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, you took the words right out of my mouth.
I suppose this is a buzz phrase which has really taken hold in the last couple of years for a number of reasons, and we can come on to those reasons in a minute. But ultimately, from our members' perspective, it's about actually what are the risks to a business? What are the long-term risks to the business that are going to impact on the value of that business going forward? So we often talk about the financial or the strategic risks to the business, but actually ESG is about thinking about the environmental, social and governance risks that are going to have a long-term impact on the business. And from our members' perspective, we want companies to be identifying first those material risks to the business and then managing and mitigating the risks. And so that actually there is not a risk of actually a decrease in value at some point in the future. But I think it's always important to talk about the opportunities as well. Often ESG is seen as a negative, retaining value, managing value. But actually there is a lot of opportunities in terms of delivering value for companies. Actually, are there opportunities for the company to see a new market or develop new products aligned with ESG issues or risks?
Okay, that's brilliant. So that really puts it into context. And I think you're probably right. Most people think about ESG as being about compliance, about, needing to be held to account, that somebody's going to ask us to complete a form and we have to tick boxes and we have to evidence what we're doing. But you've spun that. It's also about opportunities. Can you talk a little bit about what you have seen as being the sort of pressure on the market? Where is it coming from? What's the pressure that has caused these businesses to focus now on ESG?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is just to reiterate that this isn't new. Sort of long-term investors in the UK have been thinking about ESG risk for a long time. I started my career as a socially responsible investment, a bank in the city, looking at the ESG credentials of different companies, and that was back in 2005. So, and as the IA and our predecessor, we've had guidelines asking companies to talk about their we called it SEE disclosures, so social, ethical and environmental disclosures, back in as early as 2001. So it's not a new issue, but as I said a moment ago, actually the pressure and the focus on ESG has sort of exponentially grown in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is the client expectation from our members' perspective. So end savers, the pension savers, the ordinary public are saying, well, how is my money being managed? I'm saving for a pension. I want to know how that money is being managed and whether it's being managed responsibly. Is it creating good opportunities? Is it creating change? And particularly with very high profile public campaigns around climate change, around Black Lives Matters, actually, is my pension doing good, or is it supporting bad causes? So we are increasingly hearing from clients wanting to know actually what asset managers are doing to ensure that they're taking account of ESG when thinking about how they're investing the money, be it on issues like climate change or diversity. So there's very significant client pressure to understand how their money is being put to good. The other aspect is actually regulation and government. So in terms of regulation, we're seeing increasing regulation coming from the Department of Work and Pensions on pension trustees, but also on asset managers to say, actually, what account are you taking of stewardship? So how companies are run over the long term, and particularly on issues like climate change. What impact is the companies you invest in having on climate change and supporting a good transition? So there is increasing focus on regulators for asset managers and pension funds to really articulate how the money is being managed and what impact their portfolios are having on good or bad. I think the last aspect is government, and obviously they've set quite clear targets in terms of climate change, but there are a number of areas that they think that shareholders in big FTSE 100 companies can have an impact and help to create change. And they have seen in the last few years that actually shareholders are a way of illicit societal change in the biggest companies, which they hope will filter through smaller companies and then into the private sector. And you've seen that with issues like diversity. So we've had the Hampton Alexander Review, the Parker Review to improve diversity on boards and senior leadership teams. And they're really putting pressure on shareholders to do their bit to hold companies to account on those issues. Gender pay gap in the largest companies, really getting shareholders to focus on whether it's the right gender pay gap for particular companies. And then climate change with TCFD reporting around the impact of climate change. They're really trying to get shareholders to play a role and help influence companies going forward.
So just before we move on, and I'm going to bring Barry in a second, but what you're talking about is predominantly a very large company group of businesses. So, these are the listed companies which as you said earlier, are subject to, a lot of expectations from pension funds and from the compliance side. But are you seeing that downward pressure trickle through into supply chains where, to be honest, the majority of people on this call are going to be in they're privately owned businesses, most of them employee-owned businesses, possibly SMEs. So can you see that direct impact filtering through to that supply chain of SMEs? Yeah,
and so I think it comes both from the government perspective, but also from the shareholder perspective. And actually, some of the risks of the biggest businesses relate to the supply chain, and the reputational impact on some businesses and their shareholders is through the suppliers they use and the impact that they have. So we've seen increasing focus on supply chains and understanding the risks in those supply chains. And certainly shareholders in the biggest companies are asking those companies, actually what are the ESG risks in your supply chain and how are you mitigating it. So I think increasingly FTSE 100 companies are asking their supply chain to meet certain expectations, to attest to certain behaviours, to make sure that actually they can sign up that these companies are meeting their expectations as a FTSE 100 company.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Andrew. That really puts it into context, I think, for the audience here today. So we now know what it is. We know where it's come from. We know where the downward pressure is. So now I'm going to invite Barry. Morning, Barry.
Morning, Dan.
Nice to have you on the panel again. First timer for the EOA. So you're very welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So you've just heard from Andrew, and I think you two know each other. Do you know each other already? Yeah, I think you do.
We do, a little bit, yeah. Our organisations certainly know each other very well.
Good, good. So you just heard from Andrew about that sort of corporate, sort of strategic perspective, but I understand that you are very familiar with and are an expert in advising businesses. So I'd really like to understand a little bit more about what you do at PwC, but also how does this relate to businesses? What are you hearing? What are the trends in, you know, privately owned businesses, family owned businesses at the moment? How are they approaching this challenge and the opportunity of ESG?
Okay, that's a pretty broad question. So I suppose what we do, Deb, is we do advise across from whether it's setting your ESG strategy or figuring out what your, let's take a current hot topic, net zero transition strategy should be, or what your customer's strategy is and how you adapt to it. We're advising governments on fiscal policy and incentives, right down to diversity and inclusion policies, and actually how do you ignite more social mobility and social interaction as businesses. If I think about what we're hearing from private businesses and family businesses, in particular at the moment, it's a real mix. There are some who are very far ahead on this agenda and always have had kind of a purpose, you know, broader than, let's say, the financial bottom line. And I know Kevin's going to talk a little bit about that later. You've got a huge increase in, well, at least we're seeing a huge increase in people asking us about corporate or private foundations because they want to transition some of the wealth that's been accumulated to say, hold on, we want to do something different because it's about fairness or it's about furthering better environmental causes. I've got ambivalent views about all the private foundations, but that's certainly a trend at the moment. And again, what we're hearing, and this is one we've been talking to the IA and Andrew about as well, is a number of privately owned businesses saying, I seem to need my asset or fund managers to be a bit better to help guide me where I can put the money and know that it's driving a good return. And actually at the moment, the data and the regulations, there is a tsunami of them. They're a little bit all over the place. So a lot of the work we do as well is how do you navigate your way through the regulations, not as a compliance tick box exercise, as you said, Deb, but as a, what are people really asking me to do, be it my customers, my investors, my bankers, or anybody else, and how do I deal with that? So it's really looking at those different pressures.
And the interesting thing for employer-owned businesses, of course, is the key pressure that they will face is less likely from the traditional shareholder, because the shareholders are actually the employees. So they'll have inward pressure from maybe employees challenging them around things like net zero, Black Lives Matters, diversity and inclusion. They will have, of course, customer pressure because they all have customers, and they'll probably have supply chain pressure, both upwards and downwards. So they're in a supply chain of a larger company and they're at the top of a supply chain of a number of smaller ones. So when you said there's a real mix in response, if you think about the typical sort of, you know, SME, 250 employees, what are you seeing there, the privately owned companies? What are you seeing internally? How are they responding to that? Again, is that quite diverse as well? You seem to paint a picture of it's too early in the movement of this for it to be established yet. We're in the sort of formation stage. Is that what you're saying?
I think it is. Look, I think there's a lot already been done. As Andrew said, look, this isn't new, but we're now into it gets a lot more serious. I think that's important because unless we preserve the planet we're on and the oceans we use, then none of us are going to have very much of a business going forward. So there's a lot of movement happening. And I suppose if I think about, the normal framework we take to ESG is you can't eat it all in one go. We're looking at businesses on, right, where are you on environmental issues? How are you looking at the products and services you bring out to market? Are you looking at energy use? What about end of life regulations and product disposal? Financing, supplier financing, etc. Have you really got down to what's going on in all those areas? Sticking with environmental issues, we look at, you mentioned, the supply chain. So maybe some of the organizations here don't have long, complex supply chains globally. Some will, I'm sure, but you'll be part of somebody else's supply chain if you're in B2B. And you mentioned that, and actually the demands there are going to increase even more from what they were today about being able to demonstrate what you're doing. If I move on to, the ES bit, the contribution of a company to fairness in society, again, it's already been mentioned about gender pay, diversity and inclusion. And I think, again, the standards and the expectation are going to be higher there. For employees as well, our latest survey called Hopes and Fears, about 35,000 people around the world, 75% said they will only work with companies that have a broader purpose and want to contribute more to society. So we're seeing pressure come from there as well. And our latest consumer survey notes it's about 60 to 70% of consumers saying they're becoming a lot more conscious about ESG factors in the products and services they're buying. I wouldn't say they've changed behavior yet, but that will come in waves.
Okay.
So that's going to be important as well. There's opportunities in that for all of us to think, well, what are we really about in our business? And how do my products and services kind of contribute to the environmental or social aims that we seem to see consumers, investors, and others asking for? And then the final one, governance. You did mention this, Deb, as well. I think governance for privately owned businesses, some who have, if you're in the EOT structure, you've got a layer of that governance already where employees come in. But I think we've got to be conscious that being able to express your story and give the data and reporting that backs it up becomes more important. And I think there is work to do on that. Like in our last Building Public Trust survey of a number of 100 largish companies, but both public and private, only 54% had an express purpose beyond, let's call it the financial. And of that 54%, only 13% talked about how they actually delivered on it. I think that's going to come under huge pressure. A, have you got your purpose expressed? And B, can you back it up? The say-do gap, I think is going to come under incredible pressure from investors, employees, and customers over the next year or two.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember many years ago when I worked in the public-private sector arena, the public sector actually were really good at that. You said we did. They had a mantra of reporting back to taxpayers, basically, what they were doing. It's really interesting. We're getting some questions through and there's a theme coming here. So we've got 6 questions and at least 4 of them that I just looked at as you were speaking there, Barry, are all about, we're an SME, where on earth do we start? So,
Okay.
I think it's clear that we've tapped into something here that it sounds like the audience probably understand pretty much what ESG means. Now they're thinking, but where do we start? And, so I just want to put a couple of questions to both of you, actually. And
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm looking at the questions here as well, Dave.
Yeah, you're looking at them, are you? So you can see,
Yeah.
is there a particular role within a business that you would see leading on this? Or is it cross-cutting? There's a question. I think that's a really good one to start with.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that up to start.
Yeah.
So I think making sure there's somebody there to drive through what might have been agreed, etc., is important. But I think we almost miss the point if we say we've got a head of ESG. That's a role that's important. But I think the senior leadership have to live and breathe this. It has to come back to what are we here for? What's the purpose of the organization?
Yeah.
Then in terms of getting started, I see there's a number of questions on that. I do agree. If I'm in an SME, I'm going to be running tight a lot of the time. How much time have I got? And that's where there's plenty of frameworks. I've got one in front of me that we have on our strategy and site. I will share these links after, they're free to air.
Thank you.
How you break it down. What are the environmental things you want to worry about? What are the social? What are the governance? And you get started, and then you go, where are the gaps in our knowledge of what we want to do? Where can I get support with that? And one of the great areas of support is, and surprise, surprise, I'm not going to say always come to PwC. I think that's a great answer anyway. But your peer network, you know, the people on this call, you know, we look 80% of the people who answered the question either have an ESG strategy or are about to execute one. So sharing that learning and facilitating, you know, roundtable discussion, that's where we're finding a lot coming from.
Yeah.
Because it does get very particular very quickly. You know, for some, the transition to electric, and in particular for transport, that's going to be their whole business. So you have to really deep dive on where you're going to play in that supply chain.
Before we deep dive then, Andrew, can I just bring you back in? So that question about, is it somebody's responsibility or is it a shared accountability across the board? And that's what Barry's suggested. It's a whole senior leadership team responsibility. I assume you're going to nod and say, yeah, that's exactly what you'd expect to see in a larger business.
Yeah, I think it's got to come from the top in terms of this is important, it's got strategic importance, and this is something we're doing. I think the danger is it starts off as an add-on in a separate organisation that isn't fundamental to the way that the business operates. It needs to be, if it's done right, this is about actually what is the purpose of the company and what are we trying to achieve strategically. And I think if you think from that mindset, you start, and where to start is you start with the issues that are most important to the business at this particular point, either in terms of the impact it has, what the employees want, or what the customers need. And it really brings it, and it creates a driving force if it's seen through that strategic lens, rather than as a separate add-on because we're doing it because we feel we have to, rather than it's fundamental and it's core to the way that the business operates.
Okay, look, we've got some more good questions, but I'm just going to hold on to those for a second, because what I want to do is I want to invite Kevin now to join this band of three, and well, four of us, I guess, but there's three of you as experts, and then we'll pick up on some more of your questions. So keep asking them, and we will aim to get through all of them. So Kevin, good morning. First time for you on one of our panels as well, I think.
Yes, thanks, Deb. It is.
Yeah, I'm absolutely delighted. Some of you may know Kevin already. So Kevin is the Chief Executive Officer of Scott Barder, who are a long-standing founding member of the EOA. And I understand Kevin has had a long-standing career of 18 years or more in public and private companies as a director. And you've been with Scott Barder for about 2 years now, I think. Kevin.
That's correct. Yeah, that is right. Yeah.
And only recently you're celebrating your centenary, which we can see.
I am subtly advertised in my my little backdrop here. I apologise for that, but you may as well. Not often you get to 100 years, so so you have to celebrate it when you do.
So let me explain to people, first of all, why we invited you to come along this morning, Kevin. I met Kevin, as I say, a couple of years ago, and since then we've been in regular dialogue about Kevin's ambitions for Scott Barder. And because Kevin has come from outside the EO sector, I think he's got a really interesting perspective. Many EO businesses, obviously the leadership teams have been in the EO sector for quite a while. And Kevin and I have got into long conversations about what his experience in outside of EO businesses, in private and public companies, what he's brought in and what he's learned, and how he's now challenging Scott Barder. And because I know Scott Barder are ahead of the curve on the ESG agenda, I thought that they would be really helpful to bring in. And so the team and I extended this invitation. So Kevin, do you want to just tell everybody a little bit about Scott Barder?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, let me start by just giving a little bit of backdrop on Scott Barder and contextualizing, I guess, the discussion around ESG. So Scott Barder is a chemical company, and you know that makes it, I would say, a fairly significant player in the whole supply chain regarding sustainability. You know, it handles chemicals from petrochemical raw materials. You know, it's in a highly regulated, industry, and it supplies materials to composites, adhesives, and functional polymers. But they're used in a range of industries, including lightweighting for transport, which is all about, you know, basically moving your vehicles to a position where you could run them with less energy, and ultimately electric vehicles, for wind turbine blades, which is obviously one of the key sort of renewables, and battery assemblies. And the business international, it turns over about 200 million a year, has about 700 employees around the world. And this year, along with its centenary, it's also the 70th year since the business was given into trust for the benefit of the employees. So we are, 70 years as an employee-owned organization. Now, when it was set up with some fairly, it was set up as a charity with some fairly clear principles, or what we might also label as purpose. And that included no harm to the environment and a very significant obligation to social responsibility. So, for the community in which it operates. So really, we have sort of been in this ESG sort of envelope for 70 years. Now, that doesn't mean we're an expert by any means. And I think the reality of that, and maybe this is one of the comments about being employee owned, we have no external drivers in the same, or we have less external drivers for change. So it has to be self-propagated. And I think over that 70-year journey, those original concepts around no harm to the environment and social impact, although still important, were not really at the core and the strategic core of the way in which Scott Barter thought. So back in 2016, there was a really significant amount of work done around, okay, let's really think about what our purpose is. And we set this 20-year sort of vision such that really by 2036, we wanted to be, to have achieved a very significant step towards not only doing no harm, but doing positive good for both the environment and also for society. And that's quite a significant ask. And you could sort of say, well, that seems a bit radical. Are we a conventional sort of chemical business making product to sell to customers, or are we actually a little bit more on the sort of social enterprise side? And I would say that in reality we are a chemical company, but my colleagues that I work with care about the world and care about their local communities, and I think that is true, frankly, and in my experience, it's true for all businesses of all sizes. It's actually employees care a lot about these things, and sometimes in that process, that emotional concern is lost. And so I think that it's really one of the challenges is how you capture that and basically make it part of your strategic core. And it's really important because there's going to be massive impact and fundamental change in supply chains. If you were a diesel engine manufacturer, you're no longer in that business basically, or supplying into that. And so you've got these major changes occurring both as climatic events occur and supply chains fundamentally change and often in a major dislocation. And therefore it's strategically important that you really understand where you are in those supply chains and what risk you face, but also what opportunities. And we're a good example of that. We're in that chemical industry. We have a bunch of risks around, we're sourcing to petrochemical, et cetera, but we also have a huge number of opportunities in terms of new materials that really address the future aspirations for net zero and so on. So really it's really it should be part of your core thinking, and I think that's true for an SME as much as for a FTSE 100. The reality is, if you're in the wrong market doing the wrong thing and the market changes on you, your business is no longer there. Whether that's because of social pressures or because of climatic pressures, it's the same endpoint. And you've seen it already in terms of, for instance, sourcing of material from parts of the world where maybe social equality is not really primary. And so for Scott Barder, we also went a little bit further with ESG. We actually converted it into, ESG, we converted it into ESG, which is employee, and that really recognizes, particularly for an employee-owned organization, that you have this stakeholder body called your employees, which is exactly the same as your shareholders. So you've got a pretty major and important stakeholder group there. Then we've got the normal environment, social and governance, and as I said, we've been sort of doing ESG in an ad hoc way for quite some time. So the primary reason for us to really re-engage and try and formalize that is to give us that structured approach, to allow us to move towards that 2036 vision by really starting to collect that data and understanding, okay, where are we doing a good job? And a good example there is our median gender pay gap. The average in the UK is women are paid 15.6% less than men at the median, and we're at 0.7. So actually, not in an unplanned way, we happen to be in a good place. So by knowing that, we now need to stay there. But also parts of our ESG profile, we still need to do more work. And so it's really to try and understand where we sit, to recognize the increasing focus of that up and down the supply chain. I think Andrew's already communicated the view from shareholders, and basically shareholders are now asking for these reports from the major corporates. That will trickle down because they will need to understand what happens in their supply chains, and eventually for most organizations they will be impacted with questions about the environmental status of their products or where they source materials from, and is that ethical. So there will be an impact here, and so getting ahead of that curve is important. It also allows you to start benchmarking. Where do you sit against your competitors, and does that give you a branding differentiation as an ethical partner, with companies that are also focused on that ethical and ESG journey. And finally, it's by doing that ESG report or ESG report, you're creating that transparency for your stakeholders. You're also creating that transparency for your board, and you can start to really understand those significant areas of risks and opportunities, and deploy efforts and resources appropriately. So I think that's my sort of quick ramble through that. And okay. I think it, so and I think that one of the biggest challenges around the ESG and the whole reporting is also to move the discussion from input to impact. We're as a charity, it's one of the big discussion points we have on our charitable activity, which is we give money away, but actually what is the social impact of that? And that's also true for your the steps you take on an environmental journey. You can invest in something, but what is the real impact of that when you look at the total sort of carbon footprint of the solution you look to implement?
Thanks, Kevin. Wow, there's a lot there, and we've got more questions coming in. Can I just remind people to use the Q&A if you can for your questions, so we've got all the questions in the same place and everybody can see them. Can I go straight back to there's this recurring question in the that we're getting, which is where do you start? So Barry, you talked about breaking it down, identifying the gaps. Shared learning from peer groups is really great, and you said you can share some links with us, I think, that we can share later on. I suspect for a lot of our members that's where they're at. They understand the potential, they can see both the opportunities and the risks, but they really are struggling just to think, where do we start with this? Kevin, it sounds as if your starting point was it was embedded in your purpose and almost embedded in your sort of principle of do no harm. So are we saying that what businesses have to do to start is they have to first re-establish what their purpose is? Well,
yeah, I mean, so look, it wasn't an easy journey for us. We've just been through this journey of moving from, that sort of, the sort of high level purpose and principles position into actually getting some data, and that journey has not been easy. So I think it's difficult for all businesses in different ways. I think that you know, fundamentally, you have to start right at the core, which is what is your purpose of your organization, and then frankly also understanding, you know, the dimensions of ESG that are relevant to your particular business, because it's not, social impact or an ethical sourcing may be much more significant than environmental impact. And so, you know, if you're going to start by thinking about what are the important things to you and your supply chain, and really sort of focus on that to start with, and then build from there, because that's how it becomes relevant to your organization.
And I've heard some of our members, when they talk about purpose, saying they really struggle with this concept of purpose. So for the purpose for them may be, you know, we create pens. That's what we do. And so how do they then think about, well, that's what you do, but what's the opportunity in doing that to have greater purpose? I think that whole debate for some smaller organisations is the challenging starting point. And,
yeah,
and I've certainly,
but I think it comes back to why do consumers buy pens?
Yeah.
And how is that behaviour likely to change?
Yeah.
And yeah, you can draw that analogy with the straws. Okay. There was a sudden move pretty much overnight as a result of Blue Planet 2, moving away from plastic straws to paper straws. And so, you know, at the time, the straw maker would have just been, you know, I make straws and people use them for drinks and so on. And actually, what you then realise is there are actually other implications of what you do, and actually it's making sure that you think through those implications.
Yeah. So
it's worth pointing out that I don't think that's an issue just for small business or employee-owned businesses, but actually there's a lot of debate in the listed sector. Actually, what are the purpose of those businesses that we're invested in, and how can those companies communicate their purpose more explicitly to their shareholders? And they're struggling with it. So I think it's something that everyone is grappling with, and there's been sort of questions whether FTSE 100 companies should have a say on purpose, where they have to articulate their purpose on one page and then shareholders vote on it, because actually there needs to be a wider debate around the positive role that companies have in society. I think sometimes companies, and particularly large companies, get bashed for having poor practices, and actually we need to be on the front foot sometimes and actually articulate the benefits of businesses as a whole to the economy and to society. And I think it's something we need to do from the largest companies in the UK through to the smallest. Actually, let's talk up the benefit that companies have, and this is one way, through an ESG lens, through a purpose lens, that we can do that.
And make business more important in society. And I guess that triple bottom line of people, planet and profit is where, you know, we're heading, where businesses are looking to really illustrate and demonstrate where they're having impact. I'm just conscious of time and I want to move us on because there's a lot of questions, and there's one area of questioning which Kevin talked a lot about, which is reporting and measurement. And we've got a question in here about when you get into impact measurement, you very quickly hit technical knowledge requirements. And what is there to make this simple and proportionate for SMEs? And I guess I'm wondering, you know, before we get to a point which we may get to where there are compliance requirements on every single business in the UK to do all of this, the aim, you would hope, for most businesses is to get there voluntarily. But if they are going to benchmark, what should they be looking to? What global or national measures should they be looking to? Andrew, Barry, do you have any advice there?
Again, I'm happy to start. I suppose there's a number of benchmark frameworks. There's a number of organizations, you know, large and small, Andrew, myself, and there's others who can support with that benchmarking and verification and the assurance. And there's a growing number of smaller organizations who do that as well. One of the big challenges we have is actually there are so many different benchmarks, all of whom are using slightly different data. There is massive work going on with standard setters, regulators, and others to say, we've got to bring this together. You know, you've got the EU working on their green taxonomy, etc. So a lot of things will move and become more consistent in the next year or two, and I think that will help us all. But there is a lot of help and support available. And I suppose the bit I'd say as well is, think it through, because when you think about, right, what's the purpose of my organization? Therefore, what do I want to measure, validate, and report on? It becomes, this is really important to do. And I think if you don't go through that, you'll think there's a lot of stuff to report on. I don't have time and I don't want to spend the money on it. And I think that's a more dangerous place to be, rather than understanding what the value of some of that is to you. But there is a lot of support and help out there. And again, I think that was one of Campbell's questions. I'm more than happy to kind of chat offline and direct people to some of that.
And maybe it's the case, there's another point, Sarah has raised another point, which is social enterprise sector. And we've got a number of those in the EOA membership, tend to be in the sort of public service mutual sector. They've been doing a lot on social impact for many, many years. So they've probably refined some tools and some ways of doing things, which they're probably willing to share. Back to your point, Barry, about peer insight is probably of value. I guess what I'm hearing from you there is there's currently a lack of consistency around benchmarking and measurement. It's quite immature and we're some way off getting a standard set of metrics.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't call it completely immature. You've got Statalytics, you've got MSCI, you've got Refinitiv and another out there doing benchmark for the big asset managers and whatever. But what we do know is when we scratch into that detail, everyone has the same challenge. Is the data actually telling you what you think it is?
Right.
Everyone would go, we've got some work to do on that.
Okay.
And I think that will develop quite a lot in terms of consistency over the next year or two.
Kevin, want to bring you in?
I mean, I just wanted to say, I've sort of been involved in SMEs as well for quite a long time, and so it's, there is this whole issue about resourcing and and how can you actually get into this, and I think you also have to come back to whether you're actually, it's particularly right now for a lot of private companies, they don't have to report this stuff, but it doesn't mean they can't do measurements in a way, to the level that they can do, because what you're really interested in is making progress as opposed to the actual measurement itself. So providing the measurement you're doing has got some validity, then actually what you're really interested is that continuous improvement on your journey, rather than actually what the number is.
Yeah. So basically just start. If you've got a starting point, you've got a starting. Yeah. So work out what your purpose is, what impact you're trying to have, what matters to you, and start measuring it. Yeah. And then show a journey towards achieving greater impact than you have been having.
Yeah. And in that process of measuring, you'll also fine tune that, and then when the standards do come along, you'll be in a position already where you understand that measurement that you've been doing a lot better, and then you're in a position where actually you still may decide not to go with the standard because it may actually not help you in terms of your own particular business situation.
So I've got another question here, which again, Campbell's raised, which I think is a really insightful one, which is, if an SME is not in a supply chain of a larger firm and their consumers are not demanding it, what would you say are the benefits for small firms to engage with this agenda before regulation arrives? So basically, maybe Andrew, I'm looking at you, how far away are we from mass regulation? So every business is going to have to respond. And wouldn't it be better for them to voluntarily get there beforehand?
I suppose it depends on the issues which affect your particular sector or particular company. I think I would say that there's two things. One, in terms of actually what is the impact and risk to the long-term value of your business, that if you don't address some of these issues, then actually it's going to impact on your business anyway going forward because of that regulation or because of expectations of society. And the second is a broader license to operate. If you are not addressing some of these issues, will it mean actually it's harder to attract employees to come and work for your business? If you're not meeting certain expectations in terms of the way that you're treating your employees, the diversity of your organization, then actually does it become a cost to the business of inability to attract or retain staff to come and work for you. It's quite hard to talk about the issues in generic, but I think there are risks which affect every business. And actually, you just need to unpick actually what are those risks and actually what impact are they having on my business now. And actually, a lot of companies will be thinking about it already. They just don't be calling it ESG. It's the way that we run our business. And some of it is, right, we're trying to sort of label it and say we're doing an ESG strategy. It's about the way that a lot of businesses are being run anyway, because it's around risk management. But I think it's really important to think actually what are those risks on my business and how can I mitigate them?
Okay, Kevin, I see you want to.
I think you can invert that in the other way around, which is, you know, basically who wants to work for a business that damages the environment and abuses people, you know, from a social perspective, or creates sort of social imbalance. I mean, so you know, nobody wants to do business with organizations that do that fundamentally. So I think you've got to sort of change it around, which is we don't want to risk being in that space, you know, especially when everybody else is making clear that they're not in that space. So I think from just a sustainability of your business, you know, it's really important to give some consideration to that, even if you're not in a big supply chain and your customers are not directly buying from you.
Barry, have you got anything to add to that?
I think it's well said. For me, though, it's at a fundamental human level. This is serious. You cannot ignore the agenda, because it's about sustaining our actually well-being in our life. So once you take it back to that level, none of us can afford to kind of put this on the long finger.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting, Andrew, what you said about there's lots of businesses that will be doing some of this already. They may not just be bracketing it under the ESG umbrella. And I guess, is there value in doing that? Is there value in saying, as a small business, you know, we're doing all these great things, let's start referring to it as ESG? Do you think there is value? Is this going to be, you know, you talked earlier about SEE. So 20 years ago, however long it was the social and ethical and environmental challenge. I think most people will be familiar with CSR, you know, corporate social responsibility. And, you know, we have a habit, don't we, of creating acronyms along the way. So is ESG here to stay as an entity? Obviously, the principles that sit behind it are clearly here to stay. We know there's these, you know, there's a burning bridge now that we've got to do some stuff to make the world a better and more secure place. But should businesses be thinking, right, we now need an ESG strategy, even if that's about bringing out and illustrating what they're already doing?
I think there is, mainly because the expectations of employees, suppliers, wider society is growing, that you need to be able to articulate it sufficiently that you are able to attract the right people, you're able to retain your staff, you're able to win contracts, and you're able to meet your regulatory obligations. So whilst I think there's always a balance between creating a process for the sake of it, but I think, I suppose on the horizon, there is an ability, you would need to have an ability to articulate it comprehensively to all those different stakeholders to be able to have them on side and make sure you're able to attract and win business through it, or attract and retain staff.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. So I think what you've said there, you do need to articulate your plans and your progress. And ideally, if you use the ESG label or acronym, then that's going to have some resonance, possibly with customers, with suppliers, with the market. Okay. I'm going to go to the questions now, because we've had quite a few questions. I think we've already picked up some of these already. We've talked about the roles of business, of who in the organisation should lead on this. Somebody said, do you see businesses having to rewrite their strategic plans? And how do you keep an ESG plan alive? I think that's quite a contentious question, actually, because I'm not sure. I think I know what probably Andrew and Barry are going to say to that. Barry, you're laughing, so I'm going to go to you straight away.
I'm only because it's a brilliant question. Do they have to rewrite their strategic plans? I think it's a real Irish answer. You do if you do, and you don't if you don't. But I think the bit is you've got to come back to what Kevin said earlier, is what's the purpose of the business? Have you thought that through? Okay. And then is that embedded in the strategy of your business, in the processes and the operations, and in how you gather data and report what you want to report, or get ready to report in the future? And I think that to me, this is a more ESG as a topic. Is it here to stay? To me, there is a fundamental reset in investors and others around what are we trying to do in business? Because even when we look at economies, you get the Bank of England. So I've been talking to Andy Haldane, who's actually just leaving there. And he said, yeah, GDP can't be our only measure of are we doing well as an economy. You have to think about well-being. You have to think about planetary resource usage and fairness in society. And that's a discussion that's taking hold more and more. Like, next week, I've got another few meetings with some more family-run businesses, because they are now going through that piece about, I'm handing on to the next generation of the family or the employees. There's different attitudes. We need to think about what bits of the business we want to keep, what do we want to sell, and what do we want to go and buy. And in all of those conversations, by doing that, whether it's rewriting your strategy or just testing whether it's still current, people are finding opportunities to do things that fit with an ESG agenda and move their business forward.
There's another interesting comment in the chat actually about purpose-led businesses, and what you're all talking about. You've all said this, is it starts with being clear about your purpose. And we know that B Corp movement, for example, is gaining traction in the UK, and we'll be doing a session on B Corps at some point in the future. But the question in the chat is, so why is it that only 50% of businesses define themselves as purpose-led? I mean, A, do you think that's true? Or is it just that there are businesses that are overtly going out there and saying we are purpose-led, but actually there's a lot more businesses that are very purpose-driven, but they may just not have articulated it in that way? Again, Andrew, Barry, you've got a broad business sort of exposure on a day-to-day basis. What's your view on that? Are there only half the businesses that really care about purpose?
I think I'll just be really brief, because I know Andrew will want to come in, is the surveys we've done and the analysis we've done on publicly reported information on companies, private and public, show that only 54 have an expressed purpose. So there'll be more where actually when you scratch into it, boy, they are purpose-led, they just haven't shouted about it. But I'd kind of go, well, why don't you shout about it? Because people want to know it. But also, I think there's a piece that says you need to be sure your purpose is embedded, because if it's not, you're going to get called out very quickly. So it takes thinking through. But Andrew, you may have more to add.
No, I agree. And I think it's one of those that companies are slightly struggling with, as I said earlier. And it sort of comes back to actually something that happened many years ago when the strategic report was introduced for FTSE 100 companies. It was quite difficult for them to articulate in one page what their strategy was. I think there's a bit same here, actually. Putting it down is a really important process, because it clarifies the mind and you're articulating what actually is our purpose. And it's quite a big step for a lot of companies. So I think there's probably a bit of nervousness that actually, can we always make sure we're living up to it and be held account to it? And before we put our head above the parapet, are we absolutely sure that we're living to this purpose before we go public with it? So I think there's a bit of chicken and egg there, that actually, can we be held account to it, and do we get shot down if we do say we're this purpose-led, and then it finds out, sort of evidence comes to light that we're not? So I think there's a bit around nervousness of putting that pen to paper and really living it, and being able to commit around very wide operations that it is what is actually happening. And I think a lot of work implementing it internally before they go external with it.
So I think what you've all said is really insightful, and I guess I hadn't necessarily expected the conversation would go in this direction. But if you get back to purpose, as difficult as it might be, get your purpose down on a page, look at what it is that you as a business do and where there are risks to delivering that, whether there's a reputational risk, cost risks, And then in answering, there's a question here, you know, well, there's a couple of questions which are basically saying the same thing. How do you figure out where to start? Well, you figure out where to start on this ESG journey based on that purpose and based on identifying where your biggest risks are and or your biggest opportunities. So it might be that the environmental risks are the biggest ones, so that's where you would start, or the diversity and inclusion risks might be the biggest one for you, so that's where you might start. And I guess you've just got to back one of those horses as your starting point, and you'll build up expertise then in measuring it and recording it and communicating it, which over time hopefully will become just a natural thing to do within the organisation. I don't know if that's...
Could I just add one point, and
yeah.
sort of an experience that I've had in the last few months is actually risks will come up just naturally as to what is going out in the external environment. And so I've heard from a couple of chairmen of FTSE 350 businesses over the last couple of months that actually the Black Lives Matter movement created a lot of conversations internally. So there was a phase where people were changing their social media accounts to recognise. And there were big questions within businesses as to should we do it, and what does it mean if we do, and are we living those principles? And that created a lot of conversation internally and a lot of change internally in these businesses, with actually a simple question around actually what do we say on social media around a very public movement that's going on. But it created a lot of ripple effects as to how businesses respond. So I think it's not, there are external events that will create questions or raise issues that will go right to the board and have big impacts across the whole employee base. So it can be your material risk, but it can be external risk that you have to respond to as well.
And having that clear purpose that says this is what we stand for means you can then assess those sort of external issues against that. I just want to move on in a second, but I've got one last question that I want to ask from there's two questions I want to ask. One is, I guess what Anne-Marie is asking here is, what do the best organisations do in terms of ESG practice? Can either Andrew, Barry or Kevin, can you point our audience at go and look at this table, or go and look at that website, or go and look at this register? Is there a Premier League, for example, to use my football analogy, which I always try to do at least once in a webinar? Is there a Premier League of the best performing ESG companies that people can look at and then go and interrogate a bit and research?
I suppose that there's a Premier League, Bundesliga, La Liga. There are so many leagues.
Okay.
There are. If you look at, let me just pick up one example, Relics. It's a media company, and if you look at the slew of awards they quote in their piece, it gives you a flavour of that. You know, you've also then got things on, let's say, the S part of ESG. You've got everything from the Social Mobility Awards to the Women in Finance Awards to there's a lot of stuff.
Okay.
So I'd say there isn't one Premier League, but for anything you want to focus on, there are many. But most of those have been set up to encourage the right behaviors, and what they're all promoting is people who actually do what they say they're going to do and embed it in their, in particular in your strategy and then in your processes. So if you say diversity is important, how do your processes look?
Yeah.
If you say that reducing your carbon emissions from your business is important, what's your strategy and how do you measure it? And is that what you're doing? That's what the best businesses are doing. Scott actually, Kevin outlined it fantastically earlier, is measure it, see where you are, move on, keep going. That's vital.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just going to pick up one last question from the Q&A. Is ESG linked to the National Social Value Measurement Framework? We're seeing this element of social value questions coming up in public sector and council tenders. Very technical question. Barry, you're nodding, so I'm going straight to you.
It is. It's hugely linked. And I suppose, you know, personally, I'd love to see the Social Value Act have even more teeth, because I'm seeing a lot more public sector bids where they're collaborating with social enterprises. I think Sarah mentioned that in the chat earlier. And with other SMEs to go, how do we drive more social impact out of how we go about this public tender? And are all the people bidding for it meeting that measure? So it is very linked. It's part of it, in my view, Neil.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, Barry's not calling me Neil, by the way, in case you haven't looked in the chat. Neil Smith asked that question. Just in the last sort of 5-6 minutes we've got left, can I now focus back into EO businesses? So clearly this is an audience of EO businesses. So Kevin, I'd like to ask you, because you've got this external perspective coming from outside EO businesses, having spent the last 2 years in the middle of one of the biggest ones in the UK. Do you feel that employer-owned businesses are better placed at any level to lean into the ESG challenge because of their ownership structure and culture? And if so, what particular elements of it do you think are working to their advantage?
So I think, yeah, I think it can be a bit mixed. I think that the one overriding benefit is that you actually have individuals basically who are your owners working in the business. And so, if you as owners, effectively, if there is a really strong view around ESG, so social impact or environmental impact, then actually that should align really well with what you want to do as an organization and your strategy. So actually that's that sort of process. Now one of the big challenges then is actually getting that engagement with your employees and your owners effectively, and making sure that is actually true, and also that everyone understands what that means in terms of the journey you have to go on, because normally that requires some change, and I think for employer-owned businesses, change is not always comfortable, and as I said earlier, there's not a very strong external driver that you get in say PLCs, where shareholders, as Andrew said, shareholders are driving change through their investment decisions and through the way in which they want reporting. That doesn't happen with employee-owned organizations. So that engagement of your employees and really understanding where you want to go, that purpose, and actually making sure everybody understands what that means, that they're behind it, but that also that's going to require change and they're up for that change journey, I think is really part of the challenge, I think, particularly for employee-owned organizations.
That was a very pragmatic answer there. So there's a bit of benefit of the internal engagement and the internal shareholders, but the challenge is about maybe that lack of external drive from within an EO business. So they've not got the same external pressures. So therefore you've got to be more looking around more often and looking outside the organisation.
Yeah. And more self-motivated to make the change. So people really have to believe where you're going. So it's not just a greenwashing purpose. Everybody needs to actually get behind it to make it happen.
So I'm going to just, in the last minute or so, I'm going to put you all on the spot. I hope you don't mind, and feel free to answer this in whatever way you want to. So I'm sat there as an SME business owner, listening to all of this, totally agreeing with absolutely everything you've said. I've got 150 people. I don't have a head of ESG. I'm lucky if I've got a head of, strategy. It all comes from me normally, and, hopefully some of my employee owners. If I was going to back one agenda that I think might come and bite me on the bum in the short term as an SME business around compliance, am I going to focus on the environmental stuff and net zero and COP26 coming up and Greta Thunberg, pressure? Am I going to focus on impact, social impact, diversity and inclusion, Black Lives Matters? Or am I going to focus on corporate reporting, governance, and executive pay? If I can just do one thing in the next 6 months, what would I be focusing on? Kevin.
Thanks. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to basically duck that question in a way, because I think Andrew's already answered it. I think what I'll be doing is looking at my risks and opportunities and saying, okay, what is the thing this organization needs to focus on in order for it to deliver, its future plans? And actually, if you don't do that, then actually, and if that risk sits in, and there are almost certainly going to be some risks that sit in the ESG space, unless you don't use anything, you don't make anything, and you don't interface with anyone.
Okay, Andrew, you've unmuted yourself, so you're next.
I agree with that, and I think that the one thing to sort of take into that assessment is, where is the world going in some of that? So you've articulated actually I've been surprised how the debate on climate change has shifted in the last 3 or 4 months, and I expect that to grow increasingly in the run up to COP26 in the UK in November. Obviously, something like Black Lives Matter or the diversity agenda can be sparked by an external event. So I think you've got to bed it in your strategy and what are the main risks to your business, be cognizant of where is the world going and where are the particular pinch points or pressures coming from government or other stakeholders, and how are you responding to those?
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Last but not least, Barry.
I suppose maybe just to, because there's no point repeating, maybe get local, get practical. What I mean by get local is there's massive amounts of activity going on, you know, in terms of net zero groups in the Northwest, in Scotland and elsewhere. Are you connected to them? Do you know what's happening in your local area? Are any of the local towns on some of the town deals, etc.? Who are the groups who are getting involved? And then grow out from there. So if you're pretty rooted in what's going on there, that's going to actually give you a whole bunch of input from others on not only the global agendas, but the local agendas. And then come back and then get practical, ask yourself the question, what's my ESG strategy? If you have one, get someone to test you on it. Is it, you know, has it got any holes? Has it got any gaps where there's more opportunities? And if you don't have one, say, right, what do I need to do to get started? And have the conversation with employees and others. That will be what I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd follow on from Barry, because I think that's right. Hook into the passions of your team and your employees. So you don't have to do it on your own. Basically, we all face these issues around climate change and social equality and so on. And basically, lots of people feel strongly about that. So you will find in your organization, no matter how small it is, that there are people who feel really passionate about it and actually hook into that passion.
Yeah, great. Thank you, the three of you. So what we heard, I'm just going to try and do a really 30-second summary. So what we heard at the outset from Andrew was ESG is not just about risks, it's also about opportunities. But in terms of risks, what you need to do is identify those and put plans in place to mitigate against them, with the aim around both the risks and the opportunities that it's all about delivering long-term value. What we heard is it's not new, it's been around for a long time, it's just been called different things. And that the pressure to do something around this agenda is increasing daily, either through public expectations, clients' expectations, regulation or government. Then we heard from Barry that it does matter to SMEs because you will be part of a supply chain, or you will be a contributor to some other groups of organisations. That actually purpose started to come into the conversation at that point, but we talked about it's the responsibility of everybody in the business, but it's got to come from the top, and SLT has to own that as well in terms of pushing it forward. And be pragmatic about how you start, break it down, identify the gaps, and also share learning with others in your sector. And then the topic really moved on to purpose, and we spent at least 20 minutes talking about purpose, and that seemed to me to be the anchor for a lot of this conversation. So Kevin talked about Scott Barder being rooted in a purpose of doing no harm and doing good and social impact, and that it has to be at the strategic core of your organisation, and change it from being about inputs to impact. So let's start again with purpose, because if you can get your purpose clear, then you can do that. Go back to Andrew's point about identifying the risks of delivering that purpose and the opportunities of delivering that purpose. I really liked Kevin's point about it's not just about ESG for their business, it's about EESG, because it's about the importance of the employees. And then we talked about measurement and benchmarking, and actually that's really quite difficult at the moment because we're still in an evolving market. So there's a bit of inconsistency. We've got all sorts of football leagues going on all over the world, and you just need to find the one that matters to you. But just start and do something, I think, was the message. And actually that very last point, which was, articulate your plans and report on your progress. And to Barry's point, get local, get practical. That's a great mantra. I feel like I need a badge making with that. So I'm now left thinking, what's the EOA's role in all of this to help you as our members So we'll certainly be doing some reflection after this. I'm just going to ask Ross now to bring our slide up while I thank Kevin, Barry and Andrew for their time this morning. Absolutely fascinating. First time we've tried to take a topic that's nothing to do with employee ownership and try and bring it to life for our members. So thank you for contributing to that. We have got some another 3 sessions in this programme. So I just want to remind everybody of what's coming up next in the EOA agenda. You can see there a list of the events. So for those of you who attend our virtual network meetings, you'll know what they're about, and the EOA conversations. Save the date, Robert Oakeshott lecture this year on the 21st of June. We'll be announcing more on that, I think, actually next week. And the other 3 sessions in the Demystifying ESG, you can see are all on there. Really importantly, we've got EO Day coming up as well on the 25th of June. Ross has just put a survey up on the screen. If you wouldn't mind filling that in, it'd be really, really helpful because it will help guide us for the future. And just to say that the closing date for EO Stories, if you don't know what EO Stories is, go and look on our website, go and look at your last newsletter from us. But we are gathering your stories of employee ownership. It's a celebration. We may do something later in the year as some sort of celebratory event. We'd really like to capture your stories. I know Scott Bard are in the middle of writing their stories because I spoke to one of the team yesterday. Closing date for those stories is the 4th of June. So please do make sure that you put a story in about what you've been doing over the last year, either as a business or to celebrate and highlight the activities and endeavours of one of your EO champions within the business. And look out for some mini surveys that are coming through as well. So just remains for me to once again say thank you to Andrew, to Barry and to Kevin for their time this morning, to all of you for attending and asking such brilliant questions. Remember, you can carry on this conversation through the EO Hub and the details of that are on there. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good day.